What about the popularity of Elizabeth and her regime in the country as a whole? Well, Elizabeth's personal popularity actually increased in the 1590s, and we can see this through the celebration of Accession Day, the day that Elizabeth comes to the throne, which is the 17th of November. Now, parishes had started to celebrate this day in London in the early 1560s. It had increased in popularity after the Northern Rising in 1569, and again after the defeat of the Armada in 1588. And this was a kind of an informal holiday. Bells were rung, parishes and towns would organise bonfires and banquets, but it was never an official holiday. There is a semi-official prayer book which is issued in 1576 for a service to be conducted that sort of praises Elizabeth. But these are largely independent celebrations, and so we could regard those as a good kind of thermometer of Elizabeth's popularity. And as I said, these the kind of frequent, the number of these celebrations, the number of parishes celebrating Accession Day, and the way that they celebrate it all increases during the 1590s. That said, there are a number of more negative signs of unpopularity of the regime. First of all, there are the riots and rebellions that occur in the 1590s. In 1595, there are food riots in London, the South East and the South West. In 1596 to 97, there are further riots in Kent and Sussex. And the most famous of these is in 1597, the Oxfordshire Rising. Some of these rebellions are very serious. 1,800 people rebel in London, and as a whole, they demonstrate a lot of the concerns of the poor over taxation on the one hand, and the economic situation, plague, famine, rising prices on the other. However, they also tell us as much, if not more, about the regime, particularly if we look at the Oxfordshire Rising. This rising was quite literally 4 men. Well, actually, I think it was 4 men and their dog. This was not a major threat to the state, but it was met as if it was. The men were arrested, tortured and executed. So this seems to be a regime that is very vulnerable, is actually very worried about domestic disorder and wants to crush any riot or rebellion as soon as possible, and perhaps goes overboard in doing so. The second actual geographical area of discontent is Ireland. Ireland had been what one historian calls a festering sore on the side of Elizabethan government. It has never been truly kind of and effectively settled. But the 1590s was a period of particular disorder with the rebellion of the Earl of Tyrone, one of the leading Irish nobles. The regime pumps more and more money into Ireland, and a much more aggressive sort of no-holds-barred policy is enacted to try and crush rebellion and to assert English rule. And you know, the Tyrone's rebellion is very much a response to English conquest. In addition to that, we see 2 other things. Ordinary Irish, the indigenous Gaelic population, don't like Elizabeth. They call her a hag, an old hag, a witch. We also have particular incidents of the nobility or the gentry demonstrating their dislike of Elizabeth. And one of the most notable examples is Brian O'Rourke, It's a little bit difficult to know exactly when this happens, or indeed exactly what happens, because the testimony we have dates from what appears to be a couple of years after the event. Seems to be very late 1580s, early 1590s. But apparently what O'Rourke does was he gets hold of a statue, he slashes it with his sword, he puts Elizabeth's name on it, he then ties it to his horse's tail, and he then gallops around dragging this statue of Elizabeth behind his horse's bottom. Again, not the sort of thing that demonstrates that you really like Elizabeth. So those are elements of unpopularity of the regime. And I think in conclusion to that, we would say that there really are tensions in both England and Ireland, though partly for different reasons, that the regime is very unpopular. The people, the ordinary people, are suffering economically at a time when they are required to pay more taxation. At the top, at Parliament and the court, there are real misgivings about both the structure of the court and the people who are in charge, but also the policies that the regime is following. But that tension does seem to be set in particular groups of people and is not necessarily characteristic of the regime as a whole. So thinking about the 1590s as a whole, I'm conscious that I've not talked about some major issues such as the conduct of the war or more broader social and economic policies. This is an important time in terms of the development of social policy with the establishment of the first poor law, for instance. But instead, what I've wanted to try and convey to you is both what is quite distinctive about the 1590s, particularly in terms of politics, and also how effective the regime was and how popular it was. So what we've seen is that the 1590s has a very different political agenda. It's focused on war, taxation, crime, vagrancy, famine and plague. And it has a much more authoritarian nature. Everybody needs to toe the line. That's at least the theory. In reality, it's a bit difficult to see if that was the case. It depends very much on how you see Elizabeth's own role as to whether she is actually losing her grip or whether she is still in charge. The regime itself, I think all things considered, is actually quite effective. The Privy Council is very small, it has a lot to do, and there isn't much infrastructure to help it. No standing army, no bureaucracy like there is in France and Spain. And considering what it has to do and how few people have to do it, I think that the Privy Council is actually pretty effective. In terms of the popularity of the regime, yes, I think broadly the popularity dips of the regime as a whole. But Elizabeth herself remains very, very popular, and she leaves behind her a very important and actually quite problematic legacy for her successors James and Charles.